Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shauna Collins. I'm the AmeriCorps Vista for Central Hall Commons. And today we're going to be speaking with Barbara Walsh. Barbara, I read in your bio that you had started writing long before you actually started to write from a journalistic mindset or from an author's mindset. And I was wondering how that journey kind of played out for you.
Well, and first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm honored to be a part of the Central Hall Commons author series. But as you can see, I'm in a living room, and this happens to be the childhood home I grew up in. So it's kind of neat to be here with my mother, who turned 85 yesterday. So I came down to be with her. But my writing began at an early age. My mother likes to joke, I didn't speak until I was 7. I preferred writing to talking. So I did speak before 7, but I used to write poetry. I wrote Stephen King-like stories that would frighten my 5 sisters. I'd write about stuffed animals coming alive and attacking them at night. So, they thought I was a little crazy, but my high school teachers, would say to me, Barbara, you're a good writer. You really need to figure out a career in writing. So I grew up in Pelham, New Hampshire, where I am today. And I started the school newspaper at the high school, which was fairly new. I was the second graduating class. And then, I went to UNH where I studied in journalism and photography and wasn't sure, where I would land. And of course, after graduation, I went over to Ireland for a year and I worked there as a photographer. When I came back, it was 1981. I started my weekly newspaper in town. And then eventually I was hired at the Lawrence Eagle Tribune, which was based in North Andover, Massachusetts at the time. And one of the biggest stories of my career happened when I was 27. Those in the audience might remember William Horton Jr. He was a first-degree killer in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He and 2 of his buddies robbed a gas station, and the 15-year-old attendant, Joey Fournier, of course, handed over the money. They had a knife, and despite handing over, I think it was $30 and change, Joey was stabbed multiple times and his body was put in a trash can. So William Horton and his 2 friends, rightly so, were locked up in Massachusetts for life without parole. And we learned in the spring of 1987 that Horton had escaped. And, we're all wondering as reporters, how do you escape Walpole? I mean, it's one of those classic prisons that you see in the movies with guard towers and wire, and, you just don't walk out of Walpole. But we learned that Horton and several other people, rapists, killers, were coming home on the weekend unsupervised for furloughs. And the reason the prison did this was so it could be a carrot, meaning, okay, you behave in prison, we'll let you out on the weekend. But no one knew about this program. And so one time, Horton, he had won, I think, a $1,000 lottery ticket on one of his furloughs. And he decided, well, life without parole or just hit the road. So he went to Florida, where he stayed for a while. And then he ended up in Maryland, where he stalked a couple and held them hostage. He raped the woman twice, tied her fiance up, stabbed him multiple times. And somehow the woman escaped and police were called and they survived. But that led to kind of a bigger story. Here's Horton, who just literally, decided not to come back to prison. And he should have never been out on weekend pass. So this just led to a year of investigation because Massachusetts, of course, was not really wanting to talk about this. And at the time, George Bush Sr. was running against Michael Dukakis, Massachusetts governor, for president. So we started getting phone calls in the newsroom from people like Newt Gingrich. And we're like, who is this guy? And he's like, well, we'd like to know more about this story. And so it evolved to, those of you might remember the '88 election. William Horton became a part of that. George Bush Sr. used it to say, Michael Dukakis was weak on crime. And we learned during one of the national debates our story was going to be part of that debate. And it was bizarre as a reporter, like, 27. I've been working on this story for close to a year. And all of a sudden, it's become part of a national debate. It's on TV, and Horton becomes kind of a household name. And so Dukakis did not win that election. And I think Horton definitely played into it, the role on crime. We changed laws. Killers and rapists don't get out on the weekend now in Massachusetts, rightly so. And we won a Pulitzer, which this all happened when I was 28. So it was just a lot to handle when you're that young. So that was kind of my first big story that taught me, journalism can be so powerful, and you have the power to change laws and lives, but you also have the power to harm people. And it was a really good lesson for me, at a young age, to really consider every story I did and the outcome, the consequences. So that was kind of my first big series I did as a reporter.
So in dealing with hard topics, it's definitely something that you started right off the bat, kind of having to find your comfort zone in and figuring out how to maybe separate that personal experience of the emotions that are connected to the work that you do and that professional distance that's required in order to do it properly. Is that fair to say?
Right. Reporters try their best. I mean, I think most reporters, to be unbiased, to be fair, to be accurate. But when you're doing stories, I've written many stories about, kids dying of cancer. I've written about teen suicide. Most recently, I've written about suicide in Washington County. I've covered courts in Florida for 7 years, which I love. But when you're writing, I think you have to be very aware of, what should go in the story, what shouldn't. And we all grow up with biases. I mean, as a writer, you have to kind of put that aside. But for me, when I'm doing an emotional story, like even recently, I mean, I often will cry talking to someone, because it's, if you're talking to a mother who's lost her son to suicide and she's sobbing, I'm a mother, so I can't help but react as a mother would. And when I'm writing that emotion, I try to put that emotion into the story, because I want people to feel it. I want them to understand what it's like for a mother to lose her son at age 18 or 28 to suicide. So, a lot of people will say, well, I cry when I read your stories. And I'm like, well, that's good, because, you should cry. And I want stories to haunt people, because if you're going to affect change, you really have to make that story come alive and share those details, so people will remember that story, just like a movie unfolding on the page. So I again, we all have biases, but I think sometimes reporters are afraid to feel things. And to me, it's like, we're only human. I'm going to react with sincerity, because I feel like when you're interviewing people, if you're, people aren't stupid. If you're a reporter trying to get a story, which we all do, but for me, it's unforgivable to be, deceitful. And your story really needs to capture as much as you can the truth of that moment, or that death, or, like the Horton story. I mean, I was interviewing killers in prison, and there was a lot of just interesting times when my five sisters would be like, "What are you doing now? Like, you're going inside the prison and hanging out with killers." And I was trying to get, prison guards to talk to me, so I'd be hanging out their home at night, and so kind of crazy things. But I always try to be fair, and sincere, and again, recognize my biases. I mean, we all have them, and you do your best to put them aside. But stories are, I mean, I think about stories for a long time and the people I interview. I mean, I tend to keep in touch with people, sometimes for decades, because I want to check up and say, how you doing? And I often will do a follow-up on someone, 10 years later. But I don't know, that's the way I am. Reporters are different, but I find I have to make a connection with people for a story. I mean, the recent one with Bob Fitzsimmons, who's a police chief up in Baileyville, he's the kind of police officer that we can only hope we have in our towns and cities. And, he's a very special man, and you want to try to capture that in your story. So I agonize a lot. And when the stories are published, I get very nervous because you never know people's reactions, especially about something sensitive like, a tragedy like suicide.
And this is something that we had talked about a little bit before the interview. You had said that you mostly end up delving into stories that are difficult and emotional. And I wonder, coming to that kind of that place where you recognize this is not the easiest path, but this is the path that I've chosen, and I'm going to stick with it. What kind of conversations do you have with yourself when you look at something and realize this is a series about, opioid addiction, or this is a series about poverty, or this is a series about something that's really going to have a strong impact on people? What kind of internal dialogue happens when you're kind of gearing up for that?
Well, my first reaction is like, why am I doing this again? My husband, my husband will joke like, well, it's another Barbara Walsh story, but my daughter recently, I have two daughters, and they'll both say, Mom, why are you writing about suicide? And I'll say, because the story needs to be told. You can't turn things, you can't pretend it doesn't happen, because then the problem doesn't go away. But I do start these stories with kind of a, mixed reaction. I feel they're important, but they're pretty heavy. And I think this has happened more in my career as I've been a journalist for over 35 years. I realize, okay, these are heavy, these are tragic, but there's always hope. There's always hope in a story. So with my recent piece on the Washington County suicides, using Bob Fitzsimmons, who is a really compassionate, courageous man who is trying to help his community, I framed the story around him, because I think you do have to be careful on what details you put in. Obviously, you don't want to cause more tragedies. So every word is really important, but it is agonizing. And until that story is published, I there's a lot of turmoil in my own writing process, deciding what goes in that story and what stays out. So and I recognize it's not easy, but after doing a lot of these stories, the conversations, I mean, when I first did a piece on teen suicide back in 2004, I dreaded going to the home. I was just sort of terrified. And now it's become easier in the sense of, because I've done so many difficult stories, that, I just approach it like as honestly as I can and be as compassionate as I can with people. But it definitely has an effect. And, going on from this to writing about overdoses, it's kind of like, okay, well, I should do something funny or upbeat. I think I've joked with you that I did once join a circus and rode elephants and was a clown. So maybe I need to do a few of those in between. I mean, it definitely helps to break it up, because going from one tough story to another, I mean, it's, I think you just need to take a break and clear your head a bit.
That actually segues a little bit into my next question of how much recovery time do you usually take? Do you practice any kind of self-care after dealing with these traumatic kind of stories? And how do you break up the connotation of having to deal with all of the different elements of these kind of stories? Is there a process that you go through, or say a weekend in the woods or anything like that you do to kind of help keep yourself centered when dealing with these topics?
Mm-hmm. Well, I love walking. I have a rescue dog, Paco, who's from Puerto Rico. So, I walk at least once a day or twice a day with him. But exercise to me is very important. And even when I'm writing, to get away from the computer and just walk and think. But yeah, I find exercise is my healing mode, whether it's swimming, kayaking, walking, hiking. For me, I try to do that as often as possible. Yoga. Um, and then time in between stories, I was supposed to get right back on to, writing about overdoses on Monday. And, it doesn't need to go in next Sunday. So my editor was like, well, you know what, you have 2 more weeks. So, but I think after this, just mixing it up more is healthy. Because if you're constantly, it's like a reporter that covers, you're covering war. I mean, you've got that PTSD too, and it affects people that way. So I realized that, it's good to take some breaks and, plenty of exercise, and because it does disturb your sleep. I'll wake up in the middle of the night writing the story in my head. And while I'm writing, whatever story I'm on, I'm constantly thinking about that story. So it's good to finish. And another thing I do is I always follow up with the people I write about and say, what did you think of that story? Because I want to know, like, if I got something wrong, or if I, if they felt I went in the wrong direction, or things like that.
So another way that you might be able to kind of break up the trauma and monotony of the situation would be to delve into maybe some of the writing aspect of that different niche that you have in being an author. You have 4 books that you've written, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but a majority of them are self-published.
No, 2 are traditionally published, and then I've recently published one of myself with my illustrator friend, and I'm in the middle of doing another second children's book, self-publishing. So that's been interesting, looking at, there's a lot more work with self-publishing, but you do make more of a profit. So it's kind of, I don't know, I'm not sure which I prefer at this point, but it's when you're a self-publisher, you're everything. You're proofing the book, you're looking at editing, and so it's a lot more stress, but you do make more of a profit because publishers traditionally will take more, of the cost, and the authors don't tend to get as much. So that's a lot of work. But no, the books, like Gale was my first nonfiction adult book, and that came out in October 2011, and that was a true story about my Irish Newfoundland ancestors. And I'd been doing these long stories, stories that would take me a year sometimes, and they were mini books. And I watched the movie The Perfect Storm in the theaters, and because of my Irish background, I just sat there and thought, I can do that. And so I was talking with my dad one night in my home, and I was just saying, I think I want to write books. And he said, what kind? And I said, sort of like The Perfect Storm. And he said, you have a story like that in your family. And I was just like, he started telling me about our Newfoundland ancestors, how they were out in this 1935 gale. And, he didn't know much of what happened, but he knew, some of the family had died. And he just kept telling me little pieces. And I said, that sounds like a great book. And he said, maybe we can get in touch with family. And I was like, family? Because my grandfather, who was born in Newfoundland, abandoned my dad and my uncle and Nana twice. And until I was 18, I thought he was dead. My Nana used to say, I'd say, where's Grandpa? And she'd say, he's dead. I learned he was alive in California with another family. So this book, my father began opening up about his childhood, and we traveled to Newfoundland together with my sister Joni, and it became this process of learning about ancestors and this incredible storm. So it kind of goes back and forth in time. But it was really, again, an emotional story, because for the first time, I'm writing about my father's childhood pain, something he'd never told anyone about. And the way I organize the book is I kind of will write about 1935 and the storm, and then I go back to the present. So when I was sending my dad chapters in the beginning just to read, I would skip those chapters about his, childhood. I'd send him like, 1, 3, 5. And he's like, why am I not reading these? And I said, Dad, I will never finish the book if you read these chapters now. And I dreaded him reading the whole book because I thought, this is going to be too much for him. And so, of course, I told my editor, I said, when this book, we're done, I'm sending a draft to my dad. And if there's anything that's too painful, I'm going to have to take it out. So I sent him the book and, he sat here on the couch and read it, nonstop. And I was waiting to start taking things out of that story. And he called me and he said, I can't believe what you've done. And I'm just like, oh no. And he said, okay, well, there's a few things. And I said, all right. He said, Aunt Ruth, she's not in there. And she took care of my dad and Nana and my uncle when they came back from California after the second abandonment. And Uncle Tommy helped us. He's not in there. And then he said, that's it. I'm like, are you kidding me? I worried 9 years, and this is it. But it was a gift to me. I mean, he wouldn't have let anyone else tell his story, but it was also very healing because we did a lot of book talks, radio shows, we did TV interviews, and that hurt and anger that my dad carried for 6 to 8 years was slowly kind of coming out through his book. So it was, that was quite a process too with August Gale. And writing about your dad.
So you really didn't take a break from the hard stuff at all. You went straight from the journalistic side into something that's just visceral and just a really strong kind of emotional connection to the work that you do. Would you say that all of the books have that kind of deeper connection?
I think so. I mean, my 2 children's books, The Goose Lady, which is a newer one, is also a true story. And that, is pretty light. It's about a woman in Augusta who dressed as Goose for like over 20 years. And she was on the Rockland Road. So she delighted people she made over 100 outfits. And, people would take pictures, they'd stop, they'd leave the Goose, presents. She was so meticulous in her outfits that it was just extraordinary what she did. And when she died, the goose was given to the nearby Farrington School. So now school children pick out an outfit for the goose. So this, was one of my joyful kind of fun books. I mean, she does, of course, pass away in the book, but her spirit lives on with this goose. Sammy in the Sky was my first children's book. And that kind of was more from a journalist perspective too. Sammy was our pet dog. And of course, as he was dying of cancer, my 5-year-old Emma kept asking me questions. And then when the dog did die, it was really difficult for her and her 3-year-old sister to try to figure out, like, where did he go and why can't he come back? And my younger daughter, Nora, would point to the sky and say, Sammy, you get down here. And, she'd say, maybe if Daddy gets a really tall ladder, he can go get Sammy. So as a journalist, I'm like driving her to preschool thinking, I got to write that down. So this book evolved from their viewpoint of loving a dog, losing a dog, and coming to terms with holding the memories in your heart. And again, when I tried to get an agent to represent me on this book, they said, Barbara, this is too sad, it's too real. And I'm like, exactly, this is death, and often kids lose a pet before they use a person. So after, agents kind of were saying, no, I don't think this is going to sell. A friend of mine said, well, Barbara, call Jamie Wyatt. And I'm like, yeah, sure. And she said, he loves dogs. I'm like, oh, okay. So I got his number and called and expected to talk to his assistant. And he picked up the phone and I said, Jamie? And he's like, yes. I'm like, oh, okay, this is Barbara. I have a dog book and I'd love for you to read it and consider illustrating it. And he said, okay, send it along. And so I sent it, and I was coming back from Newfoundland and I was in the Toronto airport, and I called my husband on the way home and he said, don't yell at me, but Jamie Wyatt wrote you and said he wants to illustrate your book. And so I'm like in the airport, just kind of just going, wow. So this was quite a process working with Jamie. meeting him and working with him. And of course, his art is stunning. And the book, has sold several thousand. I mean, I'm not sure how many now, but 7,000 copies, because I get notes from families saying, Barbara, your book has helped my kids so much. They look for their dog in the sky, and they often find them. And it also gives them hope that, those memories are precious, and you can hold on to those. But death is reality. Guidance counselors use this book. And so people might say, this book made me cry. It's sad, but that's part of life. We all lose someone we love, whether it's a dog or a grandparent or, a dad. So again, I guess other people might have changed the book and made it happier at the ending or something. But Jamie told me, I love your book because it's not sappy, it's not sugar coated, it's real. And he's lost many dogs that he loves, so it really resonated with him. Young people and older people, writers, if you really believe in your story, don't listen to people who say, this is just too dark, it's too, sad or whatever. I mean, if it's your story and that's how you want to tell it, I believe people will read it. And when you really care deeply about your story, it shows in your words. So yeah, I tend to think, sometimes people give up on their dreams because someone says, no, that's not going to work. And, I told my daughters, I said, this book will be in a bookstore one day. And so the first signing at the Farnsworth Museum, my publisher, which was Candlewick out of Boston, I suggested, let's have a kickoff launch for the book at Farnsworth. And they're like, well, how many books do you think we ought to order? And they were like 300. And I said, no, I think about 700 or more. So the day that we were signing this at the Farnsworth with Jamie, I think it was like over 1,000 people came. They stood in line 3.5 hours or something, and we ran out of books. So yeah, they weren't happy. We all signed books and they were mailed to them, but it was quite an event to sit there next to Jamie Wyatt and be signing books as these people just, stood in line for so many hours. So it was, again, a good lesson for my daughters. I said, remember when they said this book wouldn't sell? So it was great to see. And the book is done well for many reasons.
And with that, the idea, I'm envisioning the kind of frustration for people as they get to the front of the line and they realize that there's no book to be signed, and how maybe that relationship continues to evolve with your readership. Do you get a lot of feedback from people after they've read something, or responses from teachers or the school counselors, grief counseling and things like that? Is there a strong conversation that happens between people that are really affected by your writing, and how does that make you feel?
Yeah, no, to me, that's really important. Again, it can be nerve-wracking because, you're writing about really sensitive topics, but I always want to hear feedback, good and bad, because that helps you grow as a writer. But a lot of times people will say, these stories really made an impact, started a conversation, changed laws, really affected a community, and oftentimes make things better, because sometimes people don't realize, poverty, or children that are going through, oftentimes mental health resources in Maine are not the best. I mean, they're not great across the country. But I think when you write about a topic that is considered taboo, you're putting it out there for discussion. So I do, conversation with people I've written about, and then, like you say, teachers, mental health workers. It's really important to me because I want to know, like, what was the effect of this story? I don't kind of just go away. I mean, I want to hear things, and oftentimes there'll be a follow-up. Someone would say, okay, you should look at this. But yeah, I think reporters need to hear the good and the bad, and because you're dealing with people's lives in every story, and you owe it to them to listen. And if there's something you've done wrong, as best as you can to fix it. Obviously, if there's a correction, but also just to understand how your stories affect people that you're quoting, but also people in that community. Um, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, rolling back around to mental health and self-care and a lot of the things that tend to go undiscussed because they are taboo or because they are difficult or because people don't really know how to initiate that conversation, especially, loved ones that have had somebody commit suicide. Learning how to speak with somebody in that situation is very important. And more so, the spotlight, I hate to keep bringing up the elephant in the room, but the COVID pandemic, the situation that we find ourselves in now has been such an impetus to that kind of downward spiral that a lot of people will fall into if they don't have the distractions of everyday life, when you're stuck with your thoughts and you have to then address the things that you would maybe normally go out and play basketball or go to a movie or something like that in order to balance. Do you feel like, and this is kind of shifting back to the journalism side of things, but do you feel uh, a responsibility in the way that you report to support those people?
I'm in the sense of supporting them after the story, or just, I'm not sure I understand.
So supporting them in a way that allows them when they read it to be like, oh, okay, I'm not alone in this.
Right. Okay. No, that's a good question. Definitely, because years ago when I was working at the Press Herald, I was writing about children again, with mental health, illnesses, and I, I had to like gear myself up to kind of spend time with some of these families because it was just so intense. I was reading diaries of one mom who her I think two of her three daughters were bipolar and the mom was bipolar. So it was just really intense. The police would come, and the one girl who, um, she was one of the twins. I mean, it just really was difficult on the family. So there was just so much chaos and intense energy. I would kind of just have to psych myself up to go spend time with them. And there was another mom, her and her two daughters were living in a motel room. And again, just going in there, the one little girl, she would go in the bathroom when her mother and sister would fight and scream. And, I followed her in there one time because they were screaming, and shut the door, and she had her little plastic Polly Pocket dollhouse in there. And I said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And she's like, "Well, this is the place I want to be. This is the home I dream about." And it was just, it was just so emotional just spending time with them. But also, one of the things to answer your question is that these people kept telling me, no one listens to us, no one spends time with us. And so, as much as it was difficult, it was, like you say, giving voice to people who were ignored, and typically, their stories weren't told. And I spent so much time with them because I wanted the reader to be in that bathroom with that little girl, or to be with this home, family in Lewiston, that the police would show up and I think they arrested the dad at one point because they thought he'd done something to the daughter, which wasn't true. But she just kind of wrote on our window like, why can't my family be normal? Just, it was just heartbreaking things. But um, those stories are important. And again, the details that make them, not just say they're going through a difficult time, but to put the reader in that scene, in that moment, to give them a voice. And yeah, so I think these people, they really appreciate it, because oftentimes, a lot of people don't want to spend time with them, and their lives are messy and complicated, but that doesn't mean that, they're not good people. They're going through a hard time.
We also have a question from our Facebook Live viewers. Marlies asks, how do you feel winning the Pulitzer Prize almost 25 years ago, and how has it affected your life?
Well, that's another good question. After winning it, I was sort of it's funny, like I got so nervous because people, we all of a sudden became the news, you're Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, part of the story. And, people like Ted Kennedy was sending us telegrams, the Boston Globe was interviewing us. I was quoted as saying, it feels like I'm in the Twilight Zone. And my arm, my right arm, and, and you type, like, kind of physically felt numb when I'd go to write again, because it was like I had this pressure of, well, now you're looked upon as a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and everything has to be to that standard. And it was really unnerving for me at the age of 28 to, I was thrilled the paper won it. But at one point my dad said, do you wish you didn't win this? And I was like, sometimes, it was a lot to carry. And I think at that time, had I been older, maybe it wouldn't have been as nerve-wracking. But I just found, as a journalist, you put the spotlight on other people, but suddenly the spotlight was on me, and I just didn't, it wasn't comfortable. But the good side of it is certainly it gets people's attention. I went to Florida after and stayed there 7 years. But, when people see that on your resume, you get a phone call back, and it certainly helps with other things. It gives you credibility. So that's very positive to me. But I also feel badly sometimes. I think people, like my husband's a great journalist, and some people can work their whole career and not be recognized in the way they should. So I kind of always push back on that Pulitzer thing, saying, we were at the right time, the right place, and I had some great editors. I was really lucky that I was in that newsroom on that story.
Yeah, I feel like there's almost that expectation that you have to climb that mountain when you have some kind of notoriety in the field of your craft. And I can imagine that creates a little bit of anxiety, but at the same time, you have such an amazing track record that it almost seems like it wouldn't phase you anymore.
Well, it's funny because, like, no matter what story I write, it has to be the best it can be. And of course, my editors will often, I tend to, I'll interview, like for my Newfoundland book, over a couple hundred people. And I love that part because you're hearing, stories about uh, history and this incredible storms. So part of my interested in writing is just hearing stories and gathering details. And the writing part is definitely harder. But to me, no matter what story I'm doing, even, I write stories for our weekly paper sometimes about local businesses. And my daughters just say, why are you agonizing? It's just for the little weekly paper, but it's a story with my name on it. And so nothing, if I'm writing a Facebook post, I'm traumatized if I see there's an error in it. It's like anything with my name on it is going to be, and I think that's just part of who I am, regardless of the Pulitzer. I just feel like, you want to do your best. And
Yeah, I can sympathize with that kind of feeling of, did I really spell committee wrong?
right,
Like that kind of frustration, because it's ingrained in you. It's probably something that you grew up with. There's kind of a work ethic that goes into all aspects, where
right,
you want to give 110% all the time. Um, so I celebrate that sameness with you.
right.
Now we're bouncing around a little bit, but I want to go back because we've only touched on 3 of 4 of the books that you've written, and I wanted to invite you to share with us a little bit about the 4th. And
Sorry, the Rhoda's Rescue.
yes,
Okay, yep. No, so that one was unique too. The Waterville Rotary asked me, they commissioned me to write a book about the Rotary's theme of community over self. And so this was really the only book I've done that's fictional. So I used this owl, Rhoda, to tell a story about an owl who helps her forest friends rather than hurt them. So it was really kind of fun. And I didn't have to fact check because this is all in my head. So that was kind of a relief. And my friend and college buddy, Abby Grieg, illustrated it. So it's just a sweet story. Again, it's a good book for kids to learn, to help your friends, to be kind. And especially during, I think, the pandemic, that's a good lesson for us all. With all the polarization, with our country. I mean, there's just a real simple thing if you just be kind. So this book was fun because it was, like I say, it was totally fiction. And it just had a good, simple message.
Yeah, and I am loving the artistry for this one too. We'll have to check with Michelle and see if we have them available for our local community to borrow from the library. But before we run out of time, I realize it's almost 4 o'clock now, but I wanted to give you the platform to kind of um, explain that difference between the independent publishing and working with a publisher, and maybe give us some key pointers or things to be aware of if we have any budding authors in the audience, and what to really uh, get ready for if you're on that journey.
Yeah, I think, a lot of people ask me, I want to write a children's book. I used to teach children's book writing at USM, Lewiston, and I did like online classes too. It's children's books in a way are harder because every word counts and you're not having, you've got to have really a well-written story because kids get distracted easily. Um, the difference between traditional publishing where, you've got a publisher that, is doing your book like August Gale or Sammy in the Sky, there's a lot less pressure because you've got an editor, you've got a proofreader, you've got an art designer, you've got all these people and they're handling all those details. So in my case, I was the writer. So, I did my piece. Um, the flip side is you make, a small percent of the profit because the publisher does have the overhead. But having done self-publishing, it's much more stressful because everything's on you. And you've got, not that you don't market your traditionally published books, but you're in charge of everything. Getting your books on Amazon, which is really a nightmare. It's just quite a process, especially with children's books. So, and you're also trying to pull other pieces together. You're in charge of trying to get the book done. But if you really feel you have a story that's important and you want to share with the community or share with the world, self-publishing is a great way to go because there's so many people that want to write books. It is difficult to get someone interested in your story. Not to say that you can't, but especially with the pandemic and limited access to bookstores. I mean, we're coming out of it, but both journeys are not easy, but again, if you have a story that you believe in, you can self-publish at your local, printer. I mean, depending if it's an adult or a children's book, and there's definitely ways to do it. And there's a lot of people out there like Maine Authors Publishing. I mean, they will take your story and do the designing and the printing. So there's plenty of companies that you can have take over. Like you don't have to be in charge of everything. I mean, granted, you're gonna have to pay some money to, have them do that to recoup once you start selling. But I think if people feel they have a story that they want to share, that they should go for it and print 50 copies, and try to sell those or give them away. And but if people want to try traditional, you should build your platform, whether it's writing blogs, writing for a newspaper if you can, to get your name out there, because publishers want to know that you're going to market that book, and marketing books is 24/7. When the August Gale came out and Sammy, I did, I think, 30 book talks in 1 month in December 2011, and sometimes twice a day, and it can be crazy. But if you don't market your books, it's no one's really going to know about your books. Publishers have limited budgets, so it's, to me, writing the book and reporting was easier than marketing. So it's kind of, I don't think people think about all those parts. They just think, oh, I'm going to write a book, but there's a lot after that process, unless you don't care if no one sees the book. But it can be done, and there's a lot of great, you could go on Facebook and find self-publishing groups. So there's a lot of people out there willing to help, because once you've gone through it, if someone helps you, I always believe, you've got to pay that forward and help someone else. So it can be done. I mean, it's just not as easy. People sometimes think, well, I'm going to write a children's book. And it's like, well, that's good. There's a few more steps that are involved with that process. But it's if you have a passion for a story and you're a writer, I anyone should, just go forward. And there's a lot of people out there that can help.
I just want to say that I really enjoyed the story of your career. And I think you're an inspiration to everyone who writes here in Maine and everywhere. And are you doing any teaching anywhere now?
No, I pretty much have been just writing for the Maine Monitor, which is, what I really enjoy, because they allow me to do stories that take time and do in-depth reporting. But there's another children's book coming out. I mean, I think about doing another adult book, but that certainly takes more time than children's books. So it's just trying to figure out where I want to invest my time. But the journalism, it's hard to say no to a story. If they're like, Barbara, you want to look into this? And I just have a hard time saying no. So I find myself, and that certainly, like, the stories I've told you, I mean, there's not a lot of room in between when I'm doing this, because I'm really focused on it. So yeah, teaching is also time intensive, because you've got all these, papers that you want to go over and rewrite and, teach people how to like make that sentence better. And you need some punctuation in those 4 lines. So, but yeah, I haven't taught, I've done writing and journalism workshops, but none of them recently. And the pandemic has certainly affected all of that.
Yeah. Yes, unless you do it on Zoom.
Right.
But it's good that you're keeping up with your writing during this time that you feel that you really need to do this, because this is important to your growth, and I'm sure you have many more years of writing. So we continue to grow, right?
Oh yeah, no, every story, I mean, it shapes you and you learn from it.
Yes.
Again, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. A couple of points to remember for aspiring authors: build your brand, make sure that people know who you are, and stick with it. Steel yourself for the process, but stick with it.
Right. Good words.